Welcome to the History Bards podcast today. I'm host Dee Marley, along with my co-host Michael Zucker, the author of the Eisenhower Chronicles, and we are welcoming historical fiction author Lindsey Fera to the show. Lindsey is a born and bred New Englander hailing from the North Shore of Boston. As a member of the Topsfield Historical Society and the Historical Novel Society, she forged her love for writing and her intrigue for colonial America by writing her debut novel, Muskets and Minuets, a planned trilogy. When she's not attending historical reenactments or spouting off facts about Boston, she's nursing patients back to health. Muskets and Masquerades is her sophomore novel. So, hey, Lindsey, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well, thanks. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're so glad to have you on the show. And to get started, we'd love for you to tell our listeners about your books and your journey as a writer.
Sure. So I've got two books out right now, Muskets and Minuets and Muskets and Masquerades. They're both part of a planned trilogy that is a coming of age story set during the American Revolution in and around the Boston area. And I sort of came up with the idea for this story when I was actually 16 and living in my hometown still. I was very inspired by my hometown, which is a pretty historic area as well.
Yes.
So that was, I've always sort of enjoyed writing, but that was where I sort of really came up with these characters and actually started writing the book. It wasn't very good at the time, but it evolved into what it is today. So, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the storyline itself?
Sure. It actually follows three sort of main characters, but the real main character is a young lady who is coming of age at this time. Her name is Annalisa Howlett, and she sort of ends up living this double life where she's learning how to be a lady. She kind of is growing up in the shadow of her perfect older sister, but really her interests lie in the budding revolution that's sort of taking place in and around the Boston area leading up to the revolution. So book one really follows the protagonists in the years leading up to 1775, which we have the opening battles of the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. So my character ends up joining the militia. So she sort of dresses up like a boy, but she's also trying to learn how to dance minuets and attend balls and be courted, and she ends up falling in love with her sister's betrothed. So there's a bit of a love triangle there. And then book two follows these characters through the war as it's going through the New York campaign. And then book three is in the works. So I won't go too far into that.
Yeah, right. So is there anything particularly interesting that you found in your research, or we'd love to know more about your research?
Absolutely. So growing up in a historic area, I was fortunate enough to attend lots of reenactments. I got into historical reenacting myself, so that has really helped with the living history aspect of things. And I've also been able to go to historic sites. Lexington and Concord is not very far from where I live. Bunker Hill is not far from where I live. I live, an hour from Boston. So it's been very, I don't want to say easy, but easier than most to be able to actually visit these different sites, as well as, I've read tons of books, primary sources on the years that I'm really writing about.
Oh, that's awesome. Michael, you got anything you'd like to ask?
Yeah. So the first book covers sort of the pre-revolutionary era, and then the second one kind of goes into the early phases of the conflict.
Yes. So book one starts in actually 1769 and ends at the end of 1775. So in that whole story, you see the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, right. These events that sort of led up to that first battle at Lexington and Concord. So I really wanted to highlight and show in that first novel Boston's struggle and the colony of Massachusetts Bay, what they were dealing with, before the war actually began, and then those two opening battles in 1775, and sort of how that affected the colonists of Massachusetts.
Right, because I think people who sometimes have a more superficial understanding of the revolution don't fully see how much of the early kind of seeds of it were planted in kind of a conflict specifically between Boston and Britain.
Yes, exactly. And I found just in my own interest of the Revolutionary War itself, so much media is focused on 1776 and later. And I feel like Boston is just not completely ignored, but sort of overlooked. Like you said, if you have a superficial knowledge of the war in that time, people are really thinking of like the New York campaign, Philadelphia. They're thinking about the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. They're not really looking at what led up to, there's the Townsend Acts, the Stamp Acts, all of these things that sort of really angered the colonists of Massachusetts at the time, which sort of lit the flame, and drove those aggressions and actually drove everybody into this, well, what if we could be independent from the mother country? And I think those ideals really spawned for Massachusetts at the time.
That's
Right
great.
now, as I was going to ask one more, or
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. I've got a bunch of questions too.
Oh, sure.
I'll make this fast. So, yes, as somebody who's currently writing about, the Adams family, specifically John Quincy Adams,
Mm.
I have to ask, do they either appear or have some sort of, impact within either the story itself or the characters?
Yes. So John Adams does have a couple of cameos in book 1 and book 2. The books do focus on fictional characters. I wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence in representing the actual historical figures that I portrayed. I really wanted to only give them sort of cameos. I wanted to really focus on sort of the protagonists as in a fictional light. But yes, you will see cameos of John Adams. You'll see in book 2 like cameo from George Washington. You'll see some Thomas Jefferson as well in Congress. But I really wanted to highlight the fictional characters.
Oh, awesome. So I'm really curious. So you said that you had a real strong fascination with this when you were younger. Did I get that right?
Yes,
So
that is. Yeah.
So speaking to young people today, so how did that impact you, and how do you think historical fiction could be a tool to motivate younger ones today about history?
That's a great question. I think that if a younger person is really interested in history, I mean, for me personally, it sort of spawned just because of where I lived and grew up.
Yeah,
And I
right.
think that sometimes where you're raised can certainly influence you as far as your interests and what you want to study and what you want to learn more about, especially if it sort of affects you and if it's sort of in your face. Like the house I grew
Yeah.
up next to was built in the 1780s. So
Wow.
it was literally, I grew up in the shadow of that. So
Yeah.
I think that if anybody's interested in a certain time period, it's it's great to just dive right in. There's so much they don't really teach you about in school. So,
Yes.
if you could dive into, primary resources first and foremost, but also finding really good books written by historians, I think is also another really important and great way to learn. And then, of course, visiting historic sites.
Yes.
If people live near those, it's a great way to visualize a battlefield. I think it
Right.
helps with the writing process.
Right. That's great. And my second question, because I'm really curious about this, because I know several other historical fiction authors that also do reenactments.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a little bit about the reenactments that you do and how that helped your writing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm still fairly new to reenacting, but I would attend a lot of reenactments when I was doing my research, and I was always very intimidated because they're so very accurate, and
Mhm.
acquiring all of the clothing and what you need to reenact properly can take a lot of time if you don't sew.
Yes.
So it took me many, many years to acquire all of the clothing garments that I would need to
Yeah.
reenact. And then I finally ended up joining the 1st New Hampshire Regiment a couple of years ago. And I focus more on the living history part. So we'll do cooking demonstrations. We do set
Awesome.
up camp. We sort of reenact as camp followers. And then the gentlemen of the group the group, they do military demonstrations. So they'll do drilling. They have the cannon, so they do cannon demonstrations. It's really, really fun to see the crowds interact and, learn about what it was like living in a camp back then.
Yeah.
So we sort of really focus heavily on camp life.
So that I'm sure that helps you in your writing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of terminology you learn, and you just learn what it's like to cook over an open flame. And even just what got me into it really was I was researching the clothing. I mean, when you're researching for historical fiction, we take so many things for granted.
Yes.
And as you're writing, you're like, oh, was it really like that back then? I need to put a note in that, and then you start researching, you go down the rabbit hole, and it's given me a lot of experience, just wearing stays, and my dress and pinning my dress on, and the different wearing my aprons, and it's stuff that you don't really think about. Like the day-to-day stuff is the stuff that really matters the most, and it's those little details and nuances that I think make historical fiction really fascinating and relatable to a reader.
I think that's great, because I'm sure there were moments you were like, how in the world?
Yeah. Yes. Or like, oh, was this invented then? I need to look that up. There's so much that we take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael?
How do you go about sort of finding your characters' voices and sort of embodying them and kind of make them distinct from each other?
That's a great question. It's really difficult. My three main characters, I tried to make very different from one another. Them being, one of them is a female who's coming of age. I wanted her to be very different from her sister, I painted out to be sort of like the 18th century perfect young lady. And then I wanted my main character to be very different from that. I wanted her to be interested in the politics and what's going on in Boston, and, reading these pamphlets, and, really sympathizes with the patriot ideals that are circulating throughout the colony, whereas her sister really couldn't care less. My other main character, George, is Annalisa's older brother, and he's very vulgar and crass and is very much a patriot. And, he's very gung-ho about, he's in the militia, and he wants to fight, and he'll do anything he can to fight for freedom from the colonies, which was kind of a radical idea at the time. The Sons of Liberty were thought of like as a terrorist group at the time. They were terrorizing Boston. And then Jack is this well-bred gentleman who's kind of stuck in the middle. He definitely sympathizes with the Patriots. His father is sort of, in the middle. A lot of the colonists at this time were in the middle. They didn't really want separation from England, but they also, felt that the colony could govern itself. They didn't really need the king being as hands-on as he was at the time, and taxing them as heavily as they were being taxed. And they kind of just felt like, let us do our own thing. Massachusetts charter has been set up since the 1600s. Like, let us just leave us alone, but they didn't really want separation. So Jack is kind of dealing with like his father, who's magistrate, and George is his crazy radical cousin, and Jack sympathizes with the Patriots, but he needs to appease his father because he's the firstborn. He's the heir to the estate. So I've tried to give, him this gentlemanly voice. George is vulgar, and then Annalisa is, pining after Jack, but, wants to be different than Jane. And it's she's struggling in her own way to find out where she fits in the world. And I think that that's something they're all each kind of struggling with, but I tried to make them different so they had a different voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I like the sort of link between, the characters finding their place in the world at the same time that the colonies are trying to find their place.
Yes, that in and of itself was a character. America and Massachusetts at the time struggling and with those growing pains, and you're absolutely right. That was intentionally done.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, can you share a passage or your favorite passage from your book? We'd love to hear it.
Sure. So this is a little passage from book 2, Muskets and Masquerades, and here we go. Annalisa awoke. The giant sea thundered upon the deck of their 3-masted bark, a sea that sought to press her flat upon the ocean floor. She clutched her stomach from the roil of nausea, made worse by the ship's continuous heave. In her bunk, she shivered violently. Near frozen brine dripped onto her face, mingling with the cold sweat of fear beating at her temples. She reached for Jack beside her and felt space. Frantic, she leapt from her bunk. Her feet splashed into the frigid water swirling about her cabin. Sloshing through the seawater, she staggered into the dark passageway between other cabins at the stern of the bark. Jack? Annalisa wobbled and thudded against the bulkhead. She gripped the beam above as the ship pitched from port to starboard, its timbers giving a low, stressful groan. A lonely lantern swayed from its hook, the flame flickering in darkness. She stumbled and skidded into a barrel sprung from its harness. It rolled with each lurch of the creaking ship and knocked Annalisa to the deck. Her wool dress sodden, she crawled to the roped stair which led to the upper deck. Jack! She clutched the rope as the vessel gave a stomach-loosening plunge. Her grip on the rope whitened her knuckles, and the dive of the bark propelled her upward. From above, strained voices shouted orders over the roar of the storm. Reef the mainsail! Do you want me to continue, or is that enough?
That's for. I mean, that's great. I mean, we love that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You have a very great way of describing things. The visuals there for an author, and definitely please go out and get this book so that you can so that the listeners can learn more about her journeys.
Yeah.
definitely. So now that you've shared a favorite passage of yours, can you tell us a little bit more about what you found the most difficult?
In researching or just
researching and writing this?
Writing.
Yeah.
I think that the research, it's like in tandem with using dialogue that feels antiquated, but also has like a modern readers can understand what's going on. Yeah. And I really enjoyed finding, I used this dictionary. It's like the Vulgar Dictionary or something from 1785 or 1795.
I didn't know there was one.
Oh, yes, it is there. And I really wanted it to feel authentic. But I feel like that was probably one of my biggest challenges was using vocabulary and phrases and turns of phrases that I found in my research and giving it to my characters, but also making it accessible enough to modern readers. I think that's really challenging because I sometimes it can take you out of a story, especially if it's historical fiction, if the readers have the dialogue is very modern. Yes. So striking that happy balance, I think I found particularly challenging.
Oh, of course. I think a lot of historical authors are challenged in that respect, especially when you start going even further back than that.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I couldn't imagine doing like ancient Rome or Greece or something like that.
Exactly.
Egypt.
Exactly. Yeah. Michael, do you have anything?
Yeah, actually kind of goes straight into the next question I was going to ask, which do you have a preference between writing either dialogue or prose?
I feel like my book tends to be a little bit more dialogue heavy. I really, it's almost like the scenes kind of just come to me. I loosely plot everything, but I feel like the dialogues usually more often than not come very naturally. To me, it feels very organic as I'm writing it. So I feel like I tend to, in my first draft, I'll be like, oh gosh, this scene is just a bunch of floating heads. So I gotta like really flush out the scene, but I've got the dialogue there, and I'm like, okay, well, like, where is the scene where, like, we know that they're in this room, but what does the room look like? What does it smell like? Is it daytime, nighttime? And then you start sort of flushing it in. But yeah, I think that I tend to be a little bit more dialogue heavy.
No, that's understandable. I think all of us have done that. Like talking in the car, I do that.
Yes.
I create dialogue most definitely in the car whenever I'm driving. So
yeah.
I don't know why. It just happens like that. So this kind of goes back to like whenever you were younger, but maybe just whenever you were starting out as a writer. Is there anything that you read that personally impacted your journey as a writer?
Absolutely. When I was in high school, I read The Mists of Avalon which is not
Oh,
historical fiction, but it's got that, it's Arthurian legend.
yes.
And I fell in love with that book so much that I've actually read it every year since. I just love that story. I love the way it's
Yes.
written. I love that it's very like female centric. I love that it tells the story of Arthur through the eyes of his sister, the eyes of his Guinevere.
Yeah.
I just love it so much. And I really think the way that it's written is really quite beautiful. So
Yes.
I feel like when I started writing, I really kind of was like trying to emulate her style because I just really liked that book.
Yeah.
But over the years, I definitely feel like I found my own voice, but I've definitely used her influences. And of course, I've always really loved Jane Austen.
Yes.
I read all of her books and I just really love them, especially Persuasion. That is my absolute favorite.
Oh yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
lot of people's favorite.
Yeah.
It's like a one of those that, because everybody always goes to Sense and Sensibility and to Pride and Prejudice, yeah,
absolutely,
as
absolutely.
first ones. And I have to say that I totally agree with you about The Mists of Avalon. It's on my shelf, and so is the
Yes.
video, and I have watched it and read it like every year, just about every year too.
I
Yeah.
love it. Oh, it's just brilliant.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Yay.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit? Well, Michael, do you have anything before I ask the next one?
Sure. So do you have any advice for any sort of up and coming historical fiction writers on how to best promote their work?
Oh, I feel like with promoting your work, it's almost best to kind of like start extremely, for me anyway. I feel like I've had really good luck in being very local. So my book is mostly set in and around New England, and I feel like that's sort of my target audience right now. Because people from like my hometown and the surrounding areas in Massachusetts that I know who've read it, they're like, it was really fun to read about, this our area, like I know Danvers, I know like Newburyport, like I know Portsmouth. Like it was just fun for them to read about it. And I feel like for any new historical fiction authors, I think it's smart to maybe like focus on your like local area as sort of your target audience, because you're gonna find people who are really like happy to support a local author.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's it almost is like it has to start somewhere and then it just kind of spreads out.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, can you tell us about I know you said that you didn't want to talk about your new book that you're working on now, but can you just kind of give us a little preview maybe?
Yeah, I don't have anything I can read.
Okay, that's all right.
But it's the last installment of the Muskets trilogy. So it's going to tie up everything. My idea from the beginning to the end was that it would follow these characters throughout the duration of the war. And so as of right now, the book will end around 1783, which is where you have the Treaty of Paris, even though Yorktown took place in 1781. So I want to kind of like cap it off no later than 1789. I might try to incorporate Washington becoming the first president. I haven't really decided that far in advance, but I know how it's going to end. And it's really going to focus a little bit more heavily on the spy ring. So I will touch on the Culper spy ring, which really came into its own in like end of 1778, 1779, and then throughout the end of the war. And that's really how we won the war, was because we had a really good a team of espionage people down in the New York, Connecticut area. So, and I've been hinting at that sort of throughout each book, which character are going to kind of get involved and do a little bit of espionage. So, yeah, that's all I can really say.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And can you give us maybe an idea of when you're expecting that?
Yes, yes, June of 2025.
Okay.
And I have been like planning this for a while. So I was fortunate enough to have this kind of foresight. I don't know how, but the big trend right now in the historical community with Revolutionary War is called Rev 250. We are approaching the 250th anniversaries of all things Revolutionary War. So in 2020, we had the Boston Massacre 250. This year in December is the Boston Tea Party's 250th anniversary. And then in 2025, we're going to be having the 250th anniversaries of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill. So we are like really starting the Revolutionary War. So I wanted to coincide that last book being released in June of 2025 for the 250th anniversaries of the battles. So,
yeah. Well, congratulations on the whole series, and I
Thank
know
you so
all of
much.
your fans are going to be anxiously awaiting for that book in 2025.
Gosh, I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. We really appreciate you being on the show today, Lindsey.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much.
We're really excited for your books, and we wish you much success on the series.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. As always, for more information on her books, you can click on the link in the description or go to her website at lindseyfera.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, as next week's episode features historical author Linda Ulset, the administrator of the Paper Lantern Writers Facebook group and website. Thank you to our listeners and viewers. This is Dee Marley and Michael Zucker. Keep making history and keep listening. And